Hello everyone and welcome back to another lesson in the FITTS SPSS Masterclass. In our previous lesson, we successfully entered participant responses into the dataset we designed together. At this stage, you might remember that our original course roadmap suggested today's lesson would focus on variable properties such as measurement labels, value labels, and other settings. However, something interesting happened as we progressed through the course. Rather than waiting until a separate lesson, we learned many of those concepts naturally while building our dataset. As we created each variable, we discussed variable names, labels, value labels, measurement levels, and why those settings mattered. And that wasn't by accident. It reflects one of the teaching principles you will notice throughout this masterclass. I won't teach SPSS features in isolation. Instead, I will introduce each concept at the moment you actually need it, just as you would encounter it during a real research project. That approach makes the learning process more practical, more meaningful, and much easier to remember. And because we've already covered many of those variable properties, repeating them today wouldn't add much value. Instead, we are going to follow the same workflow that experienced researchers follow. Before any statistical analysis begins, researchers take time to review, organize, and prepare their data. They check for errors, they verify that everything has been entered correctly, they make sure the data set is clean, consistent, and ready for analysis. And that's exactly what we are going to do today. And by the end of this lesson, you will understand how to prepare your data set professionally before moving on to descriptive statistics and other analytical techniques. And in doing so, you will continue developing one of the most important habits of every successful researcher. Don't just learn SPSS, learn to think like a researcher. Let's begin. I would like to begin today's lesson with a quote from Henry Ford. Quality means doing it right when no one is looking. And this quote perfectly captures today's topic. When we prepare our data, there are no exciting graphs to admire and no statistical test to interpret. Much of the work happens quietly behind the scenes. Yet, this is often where the quality of a research project is determined. A carefully prepared data set leads to more reliable analysis and more trustworthy conclusions. As researchers, we should never see data preparation as an unnecessary delay. Instead, we should see it as an investment in the quality of our work. Every minute spent checking your data now can save hours of troubleshooting later. Before we move into today's practical session, I would like us to look at where we are in the overall research journey. We began this masterclass by understanding the role of SPSS in research. We installed the software and became familiar with its interface. We then designed our dataset, carefully defining each variable before entering any information. And in our last lesson, we populated the dataset with participant responses. And today, we are standing at another important milestone. And before we perform any statistical analysis, we need to prepare our data. And this stage is often overlooked by beginners, but experienced researchers know that a well-prepared data set is the foundation of reliable results. And once we've completed today's lesson, our data set will be ready for the exciting stage that many of you have been waiting for, and that is statistical analysis. Every lesson in this masterclass begins with clear learning objectives, and today's lesson is no exception. And by the end of this session, you will understand why data preparation is an essential part of the research process. You will learn how to review your data set, identify potential problems, display value labels to make categorical data easier to interpret, and organize your data in a way that supports accurate statistical analysis. And these skills may not seem as exciting as running statistical tests, but they are the reason experienced researchers produce reliable results. And once these checks are complete, you will have a clean, organized, research-ready dataset prepared for the analysis we will begin in the next episode. I would like us to think about today's lesson from the perspective of a researcher rather than simply an SPSS user. Imagine you've spent several weeks designing your study, collecting questionnaires, and entering all of your participants' responses into SPSS. Naturally, you are excited to begin analyzing the data. But here's an important question. Should we begin analyzing immediately? The answer is no. Experienced researchers know that data entry is not the final step before analysis, and there is an important stage in between known as data preparation. And during this stage, we carefully inspect our data set to ensure it is complete, consistent, and free from obvious errors. We confirm that every participant has been entered correctly. We check that variables have been coded consistently. We review unusual values that may have resulted from typing mistakes, and we organize the data set so that it is ready for statistical analysis. And I would need you to think of it this way. If you were preparing to build a house, would you begin constructing the walls before checking that the foundation was level? Of course not. In research, data preparation is that final inspection before we begin building our statistical analysis. And today's lesson is about making sure our foundation is solid. So now we've discussed why preparing our data is such an important part of the research process. Now it's time to put those ideas into practice. We will return to the data set we created together in the previous lesson and begin reviewing it just as professional researchers would. Rather than rushing into statistical analysis, we will carefully inspect the data, verify that everything has been entered correctly, display our value labels, organize the data set, and discuss some simple techniques for identifying potential problems before analysis begins. Although these tasks may seem straightforward, they form the foundation of every high quality research project. And once we've completed them, our data set will be ready for the exciting analytical techniques we'll begin exploring in the next episode. Let's move into SPSS. Welcome back to SPSS, and this is exactly where we finished in our previous lesson. Our data set now contains 10 participants, which you can see the last row number is 10. And we've got what? 5 variables from participant ID to GPA. At first glance, everything appears to be ready for analysis, but appearances can sometimes be misleading. And before we calculate averages, create charts, or perform statistical tests, we need to ask an important question. Can we trust our data? And that is the purpose of today's lesson. From this point onwards, I would like to imagine that you are no longer simply entering data. You are now a data detective. And your job is to inspect the data set carefully, identify anything unusual, and make sure the information accurately represents the responses collected from your participant. And this mindset is one of the biggest differences between beginners and experienced researchers. Beginners often assume their data is correct. Experienced researchers verify it. And let's begin with a visual inspection. And before clicking any menus or running any statistical procedures, simply look at the data set. Just look at it. Ask yourself a few simple questions. Are all the columns present? Check. Are the participants' ID in order? Check. Are there any empty rows where data appears to be missing? I can see that. Check. Do the values look reasonable? Okay, I'm looking. Yes, it looks reasonable to me. And this first inspection takes less than a minute, but it can often reveal obvious mistakes immediately. And many experienced researchers perform this quick review every time they open a data set. And you need to understand that one of the habits I would like you to develop is this. Never, ever trust your memory. You've got to trust your data. And even if you entered the information yourself yesterday, always review it before beginning your analysis. Fatigue, distractions, and simple typing errors can affect anyone. And a careful researcher verifies rather than assumes. So if you look at our gender column, it contains numbers 1 and 2. So if someone else opened this data set without knowing our coding system, they might not understand what those numbers represent. Fortunately, SPSS has a simple feature that allows us to display the labels instead of the numerical codes. So I want us to explore that feature together. Okay. And remember that we told SPSS during the design of our variables that 1 represent male and 2 should represent what? Female. And at the time, I explained that those codes would make data entry faster and more consistent. And we're going to see one advantage of using these what? Value labels. So how do we check whether the 1 is male and the 2 is female? So if you check the toolbar, that is where we will find the button to switch between the code and the label. So if you don't know that particular, button, we call that button value labels. So I don't know where to find it, but I know my toolbar. Okay, so this is my toolbar. I'm going to start from the left. So as you hover your mouse over the buttons, it gives you a screen tip of the name. This is open data. This gives us save this document, print, recall recently used dialogues, undo, redo, go to access, go to variables, find, insert cases, insert variable here, then split file, wait cases, select cases, and value labels. So I'm going to click the value labels button. Once I click, so just take a look at the gender column. The numbers have disappeared, and instead of 1 and 2, we now see male and female, and that's because SPSS has replaced the stored codes with the descriptive labels we created in variable view. And just look at what is it there. The underlying data hasn't changed, right? So if I switch again, 1 and 2 returns. So the software is simply displaying the descriptive labels to make the dataset easier for us to read. It's as simple as that. And this is an excellent example of why planning your dataset is so important, because we took the time to define value labels when we created a gender variable. SPSS can now display meaningful categories without requiring us to type words repeatedly during data entry. So assuming we don't do this, then we have to type male, female, male, female. That would be too much work for us. So that's the benefit of taking your time to work on your variables. Okay. So I'm going to click the button one more time. That's it. So nothing has been deleted, nothing has been changed. We've simply switched back to viewing the coded values. And if I click the button again, the labels return. And this flexibility is particularly useful during data entry and analysis. And sometimes you want to see the numeric codes. Other times, especially when presenting results or reviewing categorical variables, the descriptive labels make the dataset much easier to understand. Okay. So let's use participant 1 as an example. If the value labels are turned off, we'll see 1, isn't it? And unless we remember our coding system, that number doesn't tell us anything much. But however, these value labels turned on, SPSS immediately displays what? Male. So I'm going to turn it on, and the information becomes much easier to interpret. So imagine reviewing a dataset containing hundreds or even thousands of participants. Being able to display descriptive labels instead of numeric codes can save a great deal of time and reduce the chance of misunderstanding your data. And this is a quick tip from FITTS. So whenever you're working with categorical variables such as gender, marital status, employment status, educational level, or yes or no responses, consider turning on value labels while reviewing your data set. And it makes your data much easier to read without changing the information that's stored behind the scenes. And I also want to point out something that many beginners overlook. Value labels improve readability, they do not change the data itself. So whether you are looking at 1 and 2 or female and male, SPSS is using the same underlying information, and the labels are simply helping you interpret the data set more comfortably. And understanding this distinction is important because you will continue using coded variables throughout your research journey. So now that we've made our dataset easier to read, let's continue preparing it for analysis. And the next question we should ask is our data organized in the best possible way? So as data sets become larger, researchers often need to arrange or sort their data so they can inspect it more effectively. And SPSS provides simple tools that allows us to organize our data set without changing the information we've collected. So I want us to see how it works. And you know that our data set is now much easier to read because we are displaying descriptive labels instead of numeric codes. So the next step in preparing our data is to make sure it's organized in a way that makes reviewing and analyzing it easier. So as your research grows, you may have 50 participants, 100 participants, or perhaps several thousand participants. And when working with larger data set, finding specific participants or identifying unusual values can become difficult. And that's where sorting becomes useful. And sorting, as we know, allows us to arrange our data in different ways without changing the information itself. So think of it as arranging books on a shelf. And if you're familiar with Microsoft Excel, you get what I mean. And if you don't know how to use Microsoft Excel, I've got a full video explaining, a playlist actually, explaining the various tabs, groups, and dialog box launchers. So you can check that out on my channel. And you might arrange them alphabetically by title, by author, or by publication year. So the books don't change, only their order changes. And SPSS works in exactly the same way. And you might want to ask, why do researchers sort data? So we sort data for so many reasons. We may want to review participants in numerical order. We may want to identify the youngest or oldest participant, or we may probably want to group similar responses together before performing additional checks. And sorting doesn't alter the values, it simply helps us inspect the data more efficiently. So we're going to do a sort of the participant ID variable. So if I move to participant ID, okay, now I'll need to look for where I can find sort cases. So we need to look at our menu bar. So this is our menu bar from our previous, sessions. It's about data. So I go to data, right? Then I will need to look for sort cases. So we've got sort cases here, and this will open the sort cases dialog box where we can choose how we would like SPSS to arrange our data. So if you look to the left-hand side, you will see all the variables in our data set. And these are the same variables we created in episode 4. So if you want to sort by participant ID, where is my participant ID, which is the unique identification number? I'll need to move it to the sort by box. So once it's selected, I hit on it, it moved. And notice that SPS also gives us two options. So we have ascending or descending. So ascending essentially means arranging values from the smallest to the largest. And descending means arranging them from the largest to the smallest. And since participant IDs normally begin with the smallest number, we will choose ascending, which is the default. Then I'll just hit on what? Okay, boom. Now, let me minimize this. So looking at our data set, nothing appears to have changed. Why? Because our participant IDs were already entered in ascending order from the lowest to the highest. And even though the appearance hasn't changed, SPS has successfully completed the sorting process. So this is an important lesson. Sometimes a procedure works perfectly, but the result don't look different because the data was already organized correctly, and that's not a problem. It simply confirms that your data was already in good order. So let's now try something more interesting. So instead of sorting by participant ID, let's sort by age. So what I'll do is go back to data, we go to sort cases. I'm going to move this back. Then we move the age into the sort by. Okay. And this time we're going to arrange it in ascending order. And this means that the youngest participant will appear first. So who is our youngest participant here? If you just do a quick look, that should be about 19, right? So I'll hit on OK. So we're sorting by what? Age. And have you seen what I'm seeing? So the order of the participants has changed. Our youngest participants now appear at the top of the data set, and the older participants appear further down. But look carefully, participant ID column, we've got the gender, we've got the hours on social media, and we also have the GPA, and they all moved together. So SPSS hasn't sorted only the age column, it has moved the entire participant record. And this is one of the most important concepts to understand. SPSS never separate information that belongs to the same participant. Every row represents one participant, so when you sort a data set, the entire row moves together. The participant's age, gender, social media usage, and GPA remain linked, and that protects the integrity of your data. So there's a quick tip for you. Never try to sort a single column manually by cutting and pasting values. If you move only one column, you will separate participants from their own information and corrupt your data set. So always just go click on the data, sort cases, so SPSS moves each complete participant's record together. So always go to data because you're dealing with data and you're looking at the cases in that particular data, one step at a time. Well done. And let's do one final example. And this time we're going to sort the data set by what? Hours on what? Social media. Okay. So we have hours on social media. Then let's go to data. Let's go to sort cases. So I'm going to remove this back to the left. Then hours on social media. So average number of what? Hours. I put that in. And I want to sort by what? Descending. So from the highest. So that's what I'm going to do. So that means that participant who spends the most time on social media will appear first. Okay. So you've noticed the difference immediately, I guess. And participants who spend the greatest amount of time on social media are now grouped together at the top of the data set. See? And those who spend less time appear further down. And this type of sorting is extremely useful when reviewing your data or looking for patterns before analysis. And I want you to remember that sorting helps us inspect our data. It doesn't prove anything. Looking at the sorted data set might make us notice possible, patterns, but we should resist the temptation to draw conclusions, too early. Statistical analysis is what allows us to test those observations objectively. And today's goal is simply to organize the data, not to interpret it. And before moving on, I'll sort the data set back into participant ID order. And this keeps our data organized and makes it easier to follow throughout the rest of the course. So we've essentially reviewed our data visually, displayed value labels, and learned how to organize the data set using sorting. And the next step is equally important, where we're going to learn how to inspect our data set for unusual values and identify possible data entry errors before beginning any statistical analysis. So let me go right ahead. Data, sort cases. Need to move this back. Unique identification. We sort by ascending. Yes, now we are good to go. Our data set is now organized and much easier to review. We've inspected it visually. We've also displayed value labels to improve readability. We've also learned how to sort cases without affecting the relationship between variables. So the next step is one of the most important responsibilities of every researcher. We need to inspect our data for accuracy. And this doesn't mean we assume mistakes exist. It simply means we verify that the information entered into SPSS accurately reflects the data we collected from our participants. And professional researchers never skip this step. They understand that even small typing errors can influence statistical results later. So let's see how we can inspect our dataset before beginning any analysis. So a simple but effective technique is to review one variable at a time. And rather than trying to inspect the entire dataset at once, we focus on one column and we ask ourselves, do these values make sense? Okay. And if you look at the ages, we can see values ranging from 19 to 24 years. And since our participants are university students, these ages seems reasonable. Nothing immediately stands out as unusual. And this quick review gives us confidence that the data has been entered correctly. So it's as simple as that. And one of the simplest quality checks in research is called plausibility check. Rather than asking whether every value is correct, we ask, is this value believable within the context of my study? And that's often enough to identify obvious mistakes. And let's imagine that while reviewing the dataset, I noticed something unusual. Instead of an age of 22, I accidentally entered 220. So if I type, let's say 220 here, SPSS accept the value because 220 is a valid number. But however, as researchers, we immediately recognize that something isn't right. A university student cannot realistically be 220 years old. This is exactly why visual inspection is so important. So the software stores whatever we enter, garbage in, garbage out. So it's our responsibility to determine whether the information is sensible. And if you discover an obvious typing mistake, simply click the cell. Okay, so I'm going to do that. Enter the correct value. I've done that. And you press enter. That's it. So corrections like these should always be made before beginning statistical analysis. Okay. So we're now going to move on to inspecting hours on what? Social media. And this particular column records the average number of hours participants spend on social media each day. So looking through the data, we can see values such as I've seen 1.5 hours, I can see 3 hours, I can see 5 hours, and I can even see 7. Do I see 7? Yes, 7 hours. And these all appear reasonable in my opinion. But imagine if we accidentally entered 75 hours. So if I come here and I enter 75 hours, immediately you notice that something is wrong. And there are only 24 hours in a day. So what's happening here? And this clearly isn't a realistic response. So again, SPSS doesn't know that. It simply stores the number we've entered. That's why the researcher must review the data carefully. So this is 7 hours. Fun. So the quick tip here is whenever you review numerical variables, ask yourself, could this value realistically exist? If the answer is no, investigate it before continuing. Then we move on to the GPA. Okay. So once again, SPSS accept the values because it is numeric. So however, if our university uses a 4-point GPA system, so a GPA of 9.5 is impossible. So the researcher must recognize this inconsistency and correct it. So let me share an important lesson from real research where we collected data from 500 participants and everything appears to be fine until you discover that one participant's age was entered as 202 instead of 20. And that single typing error could dramatically increase the average age reported in your study. So the statistical software isn't wrong. It analyzed the data exactly as it was entered. The problem began during data entry. That's why careful data preparation, I beg your pardon, is what? Essential. So throughout today's lesson, I've encouraged you to think like a data detective. A detective doesn't assume something is wrong. A detective gathers evidence, checks the facts, and verifies the information before reaching a conclusion. And as researchers, we should adopt exactly the same mindset. Every data set deserves a careful inspection before analysis begins. So at this point, our data set looks clean and organized. We've reviewed our participant ID. We've checked the numerical values. We've also displayed the value labels with the on and off switch here. We've also organized the data using our sorting, where we moved to data, we came to sort cases, and we did all of that. And we are now almost ready to begin analyzing our data set. But before we do that, there is one final task every researcher should complete. We need to save a clean, verified copy of our dataset so that we always have a reliable version to work from. And you're going to do that together. So if you've not saved your dataset, this is how we do it. Okay. So let's go through one more time. We've now completed several important quality checks. We've also reviewed our participant records, inspected our numerical variables, displayed our value labels. We've also organized the data set using sorting, also discussed how to identify and correct obvious data entry errors. And at this point, I think our data set is clean, organized, and ready for statistical analysis. So before we begin analyzing any data, there is one final habit I would like you to develop. The habit is saving a clean version of your data set. And you might be wondering, didn't we already save this data set in the previous lesson? The answer is yes. But experienced researchers rarely work with only one version of their data. As a research project, develops, your data set changes. You may correct typing errors, you may add new participants, you may create new variables, you may recode existing variables. If something goes wrong, having only one copy of your dataset can become a serious problem. And that's why professional researchers create different versions of their files at important stages of the project. So for example, you might have social media study underscore probably raw. So this contains the original data exactly as it was entered. After reviewing and checking your data, you might save another version called social media study clean. That's it. And this becomes your verified data set ready for statistical analysis. And later, after creating additional variables or transforming data, you might say, oh, the final copy. So each version represents an important stage in your research journey. Okay, so we're going to save our clean data set together. So what we do is we go to File, okay, then we select Save As. But when you select Save As, you just overwrite it. We want to save a new copy. Okay, so we are replacing our original file and we're going to save a new version. So I'll go Save As, and I want to save it as social media underscore steady underscore clean. That's it. So now that I've typed this particular name here, it clearly describes the stage of the project. So anyone looking at this file in 6 months' time will immediately understand that this is clean and verified version of the data set. So you need to select the location so you can browse. So what I did, if I want to go back one level within my document folder, then I created a folder here. Where is my folder? SPSS Masterclass, and that is where I'm saving it. So social media study clean. You can pick a location on your desktop. When you look at the C, whichever location you're comfortable with, please go ahead and do that, but make sure it is saved. Then I'll hit on save. So once I hit on save, you see, Check the title bar, social media study clean is what you see over there. Okay. So let me give you one piece of advice that has helped countless researchers. Never rely on a single copy of your work. Computers can fail, files can become corrupted, mistakes can happen, and having well-organized versions of your dataset allows you to return to an earlier state if something unexpected occurs. So it's a simple habit that can save hours or even days of work. Okay. And this habit isn't limited to SPSS. So whether you're working in Excel, Power BI, Python, R, SQL, or any other data analysis tool, version control is considered good professional practice. So learning this habit now will benefit you throughout your career. So let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. When we began this masterclass, SPS was simply a new piece of software. Today, we've designed a research dataset, entered participants' responses, reviewed the information carefully, organized the data, verified its accuracy, and saved a clean version ready for analysis. And these are exactly the same steps followed in many real-world research projects. You are no longer just learning software, you are learning the workflow of a researcher. And up to this point, every lesson has been building towards one exciting milestone. We've prepared our data, done the quality checks, organized everything carefully, and now we're finally ready to begin asking questions about the data. So, what is the average age of our participant? How many males and females took part in the study? I beg your pardon. And what's the average number of hours students spend on social media each day? And what is the average GPA? And these are examples of descriptive statistics, and they will be the focus of our next lesson. So we're going to return to our presentation and summarize what we've accomplished today before looking ahead to episode 7. Welcome back, and we've now completed another important stage in our research journey. And in today's lesson, we focused on preparing our dataset before beginning any statistical analysis. We learned that entering data into SPSS is only part of the process. Before we analyze our data, we must first make sure it is accurate, complete, and well organized. And we began by reviewing our dataset through a visual inspection, checking that the values entered were reasonable and consistent with our research study. We then explored value labels and saw how SPSS can display meaningful labels such as male and female instead of the numerical codes we entered during data collection. And this makes categorical data much easier to read without changing the underlying values. We also learn how to sort our dataset using different variables while understanding that SPSS always keeps each participant's information together. Sorting changes the order of the records, but it never changes the data itself. We also discussed the importance of inspecting our dataset for accuracy by looking for values that don't make sense within the context of our study. And more importantly, we learned that researchers should only correct genuine data entry mistakes after checking the original source of the information. And finally, we introduced the habit of saving a clean, verified version of the dataset before beginning any statistical analysis. And this is a professional practice that protects your work and allows you to return to an earlier version if needed. So if there is one lesson I would like you to remember from today, it's this: never rush into statistical analysis. Take time to review, organize, and verify your data first. So a well-prepared data set leads to more reliable analysis and more trustworthy conclusions. Today, we've completed another important step in the research process, and our data set is now ready for analysis. Thank you once again for joining me for another lesson in the FITTS SPSS Masterclass. Today, we've reached another important milestone in our research journey. We learned that successful data analysis doesn't begin with running statistical tests. It begins with preparing your data carefully. We reviewed our data set, verified the information we entered, organized our data, explored value labels, and discussed the importance of identifying and correcting genuine data entry errors before beginning any analysis. And these may seem like, simple tasks, but they are habits that experienced researchers practice every day. And the quality of your statistical analysis will always depend on the quality of the data you prepare. And I hope this lesson has shown you that good research is not about rushing through software menus. It's about following a structured process that produces reliable and meaningful results. If you found today's lesson helpful, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing if you haven't already, and sharing the playlist with classmates, colleagues, or anyone who wants to learn SPSS the right way. Your support helps us continue creating, free, high-quality learning resources for students, researchers, educators, and professionals around the world. And before you leave, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is the one data preparation habit you will start using in your own research after today's lesson? It could be reviewing your data before analysis, saving clean versions of your data set, checking for data entry errors, or using value labels more effectively. I want you to share your thoughts below. I read the comments and I would love to hear about your learning journey. And in our next episode, we will finally begin exploring descriptive statistics. We will use the dataset we've carefully built and prepared to answer important questions about our participants, such as the average age, social media usage, and academic performance. So this is where our data begins to tell its story, and I can't wait to share that journey with you. Until then, keep learning, keep practicing, and keep building your research skills. And remember, don't just learn SPSS, learn to think like a researcher. I'm Fifi Falmoving, and I'll see you in the next lesson.